سلام، من مریم آتش نوابی هستم و برنامه امشب پل.
Good evening and welcome to Poll. Amid President Hamid Karzai's declaration that he received enough votes for re-election comes a statement from the United States Ambassador to Afghanistan, Karl Inderfurth, urging the president not to declare victory just yet until allegations of voter fraud have been resolved.
در انتخابات علیه براسی و حال اعتماد بالای رئیس جمهور از اعلان خدا.
The United Nations Electoral Complaints Commission will take a closer look at voting in as many as 600 polling stations where vote tampering and ballot stuffing like this, caught on tape, may have been committed.
تقالب و پرنمودن صندوق‌های رایدهی توسط افراد ناشناس قسمی که شما می‌بینید.
Tonight, we'll examine possible voter fraud, discuss the possibility of a runoff election, and look at the expectations from the international community for the next administration.
انتخابات دوباره و توقعات جامعه جهانی از حکومت بعدی افغانستان. با ما Karl Inderfurth.
Joining me is Karl Inderfurth, a member of the National Democratic Institute's International Election Observation Mission during the recent presidential election. Ambassador Inderfurth also serves as the director of George Washington University's graduate program in international affairs and was Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia during the Clinton administration.
معاون وزارت خارجه آمریکا در امور آسیای جنوبی در زمان اداره کلینتون افایه وظیفه نمودند.
Brian Katulis is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he focuses on U.S. national security policy in the Middle East and South Asia. Mr. Katulis also served as an election observer in the Afghan presidential election for Democracy International.
مراقب انتخاباتی در انتخابات افغانستان و نمایندگی Democracy International اشتراک نموده بودند.
And also with us is Alexander Thier, the director of Afghanistan and Pakistan programs and senior rule of law advisor at the United States Institute for Peace. Thank you for joining me.
Ambassador Inderfurth, you were just there as an election observer in Afghanistan. Do you think that the elections were legitimate?
We still have that to be determined. I think that the Electoral Complaints Commission and Mr. Grant Kippen are still going through the Priority A allegations. I think they had over 2,000 complaints, and about 600 of them are being looked at now. So I think we need to see this process play itself out. Clearly there were instances of fraud. How widespread they were and whether or not they were decisive in terms of the outcome, I don't think we know the answer to that yet. But I am concerned about that direction. I saw millions of people going to vote on election day. It was an inspiration again to see so many Afghans taking part in the process. I hope at the end of the day it was a legitimate process because they deserve it.
Based on what you saw, do you think that the level of fraud could have been to the level where President Karzai would not have gotten the 50%?
I can't answer that because we were just in Kabul. The National Democratic Institute had observers in 19 of the 34 provinces. A lot of these allegations are coming from those provinces we did not have observers in because of the insecurity and the rest. So we have to sort of pool all the resources from the various observers, missions, and obviously the Afghan observers themselves and the Electoral Complaints Commission and see what they come up with.
You mentioned in some provinces there were no international observers. In those cases, could an Afghan who saw fraud take their complaint to the Electoral Complaints Commission?
I certainly hope so. That's what it's there for. And I think that they are doing a very admirable job at this stage, and I hope that they can have the time to complete it thoroughly, because again, what is needed at the end of the day is for whatever candidate wins, whoever takes over, that candidate is seen as legitimate and credible, and that the Afghan people their will has been taken into account.
Brian, you're an expert on elections, and you were there also as an observer. What do you think? Do you think the elections were legitimate?
Well, I think it's still too soon to tell, and it's not the role of international observers really to judge this. This is for the Afghan people. This is their process. Our role was to try to support the integrity of the process by offering a set of independent eyes and then offering some recommendations to the electoral authorities on how they might enhance the process. We don't deem legitimacy or free or fair or other things. That is largely, I think, the Afghan people. And one thing, though, about these elections, I thought it was quite remarkable that these elections even took place, given the level of violence, the intimidation. I thought it was inspiring to see so many Afghan citizens show up in the face of these threats, and it's quite a remarkable thing.
Let's say that the Complaints Commission says that this election, there was high levels of fraud, and it determined the results. Could the Complaints Commission call for a runoff or for a new election?
They have a couple of different remedies that they can engage in. They can exclude specific ballots, and that's something that they have already done. They have looked at some ballot boxes and said these are clearly problematic. For instance, all of the ballots were marked in exactly the same way by the same pen, and they excluded those ballots. So they have the power to exclude specific ballots. They have also called for a process that will look at all of the ballot boxes across the country where there are more than 95% of votes for one candidate, or there are more than 600 ballots in one box, because the Electoral Commission estimated that there would be a maximum of 600 voters. That would indicate approximately 100% turnout. But we know from the figures that turnout was more in the range of 20 to 50% in different polling stations, so consistent 100% turnout would indicate a problem. They have called for a recount of all of the boxes nationwide that meet that criteria. So they could be talking about excluding potentially hundreds of thousands of votes. In addition to that, they can also sanction individuals for having committed fraud. And finally, they can demand a revote in certain districts. Now, the question of whether that could potentially be on a national scale, on a provincial scale, or on a district scale is unclear from the law.
Taking that with respect to legitimacy of this elections, Ambassador Inderfurth, do you think there's a point where if so many votes are excluded that it may run to a point where people will see the whole process as being illegitimate? I
hope not, because I think that the international community is committed to Afghanistan. There's no question in my mind about that. Just recently, Defense Secretary Gates said that the United States has learned the lessons of Afghanistan and we will not abandon Afghanistan. But for us to be successful in Afghanistan, we need a government and a leadership that we can work with. And if that government or leadership is seen as illegitimate by the Afghan people, that makes it very difficult. There are a lot of things that we can do to assist Afghanistan. We can help on security. We can help on civilian development. We can help on training the Afghan security forces. But in terms of the legitimacy of the Afghan government and the issue of corruption, that's something the Afghans have to do. So I'm hoping.
Yeah,
I'm
Ambassador
hopeful.
Eikenberry has, requested President Karzai not to declare victory until the process has run its course and the Complaints Commission can assess all the complaints. Do you think the U.S. has leverage to ensure that the rights of Afghan citizens are provided, but without appearing to interfere in this internal process?
We wanted to see an election unfold in which all candidates had a chance to make their case to the Afghan people. And indeed, it was in that sense, you did see the candidates going out talking about issues, not only at the presidential level, but at the provincial council level, which was actually the part of the election that has not gotten as much attention that I think that it should. The provincial councils are an important ingredient of Afghanistan's self-government. So again, I think that we should let the process unfold and try to play whatever constructive role we can in that regard.
When we come back, what challenges should the next president of Afghanistan take on first, whoever that may be? Back with Ambassador Karl Inderfurth, Brian Katulis, and Alex Thier.
Some of the UN observers have already been quoted as saying that they were seriously disgusted at some of the actions of the IEC, in that certain announcements would be made on a day and then later that day the announcement would change with respect to results. So what do you think of that?
I think at this stage we can't demand perfection, that you'll have instances where there's miscommunication, maybe mismanagement, but I have not yet seen clear evidence of the Independent Election Commission operating in a way that was completely biased in favor of one candidate or another.
One thing that the international community did not do after the 2005 election was to stay involved to help assist the Afghans in improving that electoral system. There was no funding for 3 years, and then in 2007 some funding came for voter registration, and in 2008 the international community took its eye off the ball. We should do more to assist as Afghanistan goes to its next elections. and indeed the next presidential elections 5 years from now. So we can help there.
Alex, you have followed the bond process from the beginning and the development of Afghan institutions. If there were to be a runoff, some view that the UN should appoint some type of interim government and President Karzai should step down, and then that you would really have a level playing field. Do you think that could be done?
I think that the more important thing is not necessarily to replace the government, but is to try and do things that we didn't do the first time around, based on the knowledge of how the first round went.
And what are some of those things?
Well, I think that there's a couple of different things. I mean, first of all, we obviously know where some of the key problems are. There have been all of these complaints. We've now looked or the Electoral Complaints Commission will have looked at thousands of ballot boxes, and so we can identify districts where there are problems. Also coming from the complaints, you have stories both in the media as well as directly in the complaints about people who were intimidated, whose polling stations were shut down, and so we could have a targeted effort to make sure that those places that had problems before are not repeated. I think that there are some other things that we could potentially do more broadly. One of the things that was going to be interesting about this election, different from the previous ones, is that the ballots were going to be counted at the polling station. And that means the potential for a process called parallel vote tabulation, where you have people watching the number of voters going into the polls during the day, and then you have people watching the count. And if the count and the number of people going into the polling station are at great variance with each other, then there's a much more effective way to detect fraud.
I think one of the priorities should be for participation by women. Their voting turnout was much lower than in the past. Intimidations and threats were aimed at them, those campaigning for office in the provincial councils as well as just voters. And I think that a special effort should be made to provide greater assurances and security for women so that they can continue their participation in the process. This was a target by the insurgents and others this time. They need help.
And as an observer, the participation of women, the issue of males having taken the voting cards of females and having gone and voted for who maybe they wanted, how do you think that could be addressed if there were another round?
That's illegal. So you've got to have observers in the polling places, and you cannot do proxy voting. It's very clear. So that would suggest more observers and more people that understand the rules and abide by them. So
I agree with him. I mean, one question I have is how long it will take to actually tabulate and certify the results. I've heard scenarios from some of my colleagues who are still in Kabul who are saying you could have not only weeks but perhaps a month or two more before all of these complaints are adjudicated. I don't know if that's realistic or not. Then that raises questions of then, can you actually hold a second round election? I agree with a lot of the reforms that are necessary to help enhance the electoral system. You may not be able to implement between a first and second round, but it's not too early to start thinking about the parliamentary elections. And one key issue that's been identified by all observer groups were the problems that existed with the voter registry list and the voter ID card. We talked about this. Tens of millions of dollars were spent on voter registration and a voter registry list, and there was a huge problem with this. And in fact, the percentage of turnout, I don't think we'll ever have an accurate figure of that because we don't know what the denominator was. A few days before the election, some people were saying 17 million registered voters. Turned out to be somewhere around 15 million, but nobody actually really knows because there weren't consistent lists developed.
It was reported that the Electoral Commission threw out probably about 200,000 votes, and there was the 600 complaints of sites that came in. But particularly in Ghazni, Paktian, Kandahar, there were more problems. And this is an area where President Karzai, as a Pashtun, was expected to do well. As an election observer, were there any discussions on the ground regarding ethnicity and how that may have had an impact on voting patterns or fraud?
One thing that Afghanistan clearly does not need is to be divided along ethnic lines. It's one country and they have problems that they all have to address. So I was glad during the campaign itself that there was an attempt to reach out to all groups, including Tajiks and Pashtuns and Hazara and others, and this was a good sign.
Alex, do you think the politics transcended the ethnicities?
Well, I want to say something very important, I think, about the runoff. One thing that people are talking about is that if there's a runoff, you have the potential for ethnic division in the country, with Abdullah largely representing Tajiks and other minorities, and Hamid Karzai representing Pashtuns. And I think that this is a very dangerous argument for people to be making. If the way we think about Afghanistan is that there can never be an electoral contest between people of different ethnicities, then that, in my opinion, is much more dangerous than the actual effect of an election itself would be. I agree with Ambassador Inderfurth that I think that the candidates themselves have really gone out of their way, in contrast to some other post-conflict elections we've seen in the last few years, have gone out of their way to appeal to a broad range of ethnic groups, to speak in multiple languages to those groups, to dress. One of the best things about the election is that when you drive around and you see the campaign posters, you see Hamid Karzai in Uzbek dress and Kandahari dress, you see Abdullah wearing things from different parts of the country. They clearly all have this idea that the way forward for Afghanistan is one that has Afghanistan as a national group as opposed to a division of ethnic groups.
When we return, a look behind the scenes with Ambassador Inderfurth in his role as an election observer in Afghanistan. Back with Alex Thier, Brian Katulis, and Ambassador Karl Inderfurth.
I want to focus on the outcome of this election in respect to the international community's role. Some have been saying that, you know, if Karzai wins or if another candidate wins, there's still going to be a focus on making sure that the appointments in the cabinet are of, you know, qualified individuals, and that this can help reduce some of the corruption. But some of the reports have said that Karzai has already made a lot of promises to warlords. So what do you think can happen? Can the international community have a role, Alex, in that process after the election?
Well, I think that we have to. I think that regardless of the outcome of the election, one of the most important things for this next government is to overcome the perception that the Afghan government has become corrupt, has become associated with drug lords, is associated with warlords. That has to be the top priority with the next president, whoever it is. And that's going to require significant support from the international community. There are things that can be put into place. For instance, a few years ago, there was a panel for presidential appointments that was created that was meant to vet high-level appointments, governors, police chiefs, and so on. But it wasn't really given the teeth to be able to do its job.
Ambassador Inderfurth, some Afghans think that behind the scenes, the U.S. may be already in discussions with Dr. Abdullah to try to come out to some type of coalition building, power sharing deal. Do you think that's happening?
I would like to see after the election Hamid Karzai and Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani and all those that care deeply about Afghanistan's future find a way to join together to address these problems. Now, who's trying to engineer this? I think it has to be done by the Afghans themselves. This was an Afghan-run election. It should be an Afghan-run government. Clearly, we would like to see the strongest possible government formed.
But some would say that perhaps this process, if there are problems in it, will actually have strengthened the Taliban. Do you agree with that?
If this election is seen to have been fraudulent, not just based on the insecurity that kept the voter turnout down, but if it's seen to be fraudulent and the Afghans do not find a way to address that, then it certainly will give rise to a lot of disillusionment among the Afghan people. Democracy is a young thing in Afghanistan. It's only been 8 years. The Constitution has been adopted. There have been 2 elections earlier.
To me, and what I've seen in many countries around the Middle East and South Asia and other places, is that an election process itself doesn't necessarily bestow legitimacy on a leader. It's whether those leaders or those institutions provide for the basic needs. It's something I think we all have discussed and have written about, that an election is just one moment in time, and I think the most important thing is, will the Afghan leaders step up and actually develop a program for better governance, for fighting the corruption, and to make the lives better for their own people? And I think what the U.S. can do and other international actors is to help them with a clear program and actually demand certain commitments and certain targets towards fulfilling those objectives to meeting the needs of their people.
You just noted the importance of leadership.
Right.
No matter who is the next leader of Afghanistan for the next 5 years, what do you think some of the major steps that they should take to help keep the country moving in the right direction?
Well, I indicated many of those, and Alex had talked about them, and the ambassador also. I mean, there's serious concern about the drug trafficking, for instance, and the impact it has on the economy of Afghanistan. Decent governance and a governance that is decentralized. I think there's a lot of talk about the need to shift the focus a bit away from the national government. And I think at this stage, it's still a lot of talk. We need to discuss more what's happening in these provincial councils. What can governors actually do? How can we actually develop programs that really have an impact beyond Kabul? And I think that's a big part of the challenge. But it all comes back to a focus. This sounds simple, but I think it's often forgotten. Basic needs. Do civilians feel secure in their neighborhoods? Is there an opportunity for people to get a job, to feed their family, and to get an education? And it's those sorts of things, those building blocks that I think are as essential as any troop training or police training programs we might contemplate.
And Alex, what do you think the priorities should be for the next leader?
Well, I think that there are really three key priorities that Afghanistan has to focus on right now. The first is obviously security. Without security, all the other things that we might do, healthcare, building roads, education, and so on, that all goes up in smoke. The second, I think, is justice and impunity. I think that the thing that has turned Afghans away from the promise of the post-Bond, post-Taliban government the most has been the fact that there hasn't been good governance, that the police are often believed to be corrupt at the local level, that people don't feel secure, not only their personal security, but they don't feel that they can get a good decision, that they can get justice, and that there's not justice for the powerful when they do wrong. And the third thing is food. There are real food security problems in Afghanistan. It remains mostly a subsistence farming country, and self-sufficiency for Afghans, fair prices for Afghan farmers, I think will make the biggest difference economically and personally for Afghans. And so I think if we focus on those three priorities, like a laser beam, the international community together with the Afghan government for the next few years, we would see a turnaround, and then the longer term goals of education, healthcare, and those sorts of things can take root.
Even if all these things are done, if Afghanistan's neighbors are not part of that solution, Afghanistan will never be a stable and secure country. Something I think that the international community can do and the United States can do is to try to find a regional approach to get Afghanistan's neighbors, and principally thinking Pakistan, also Iran and others, other regional players including India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, get the international community to find a way to ensure non-interference in Afghanistan's affairs. There has been some discussion about having Afghanistan become a permanently neutral country with guarantees from the UN Security Council. Something needs to be done to deal with the sometimes predatory neighbors or great powers that have continued to interfere in Afghanistan's affairs. And I think that that's something that can be done and that the international community can work together to ensure. A lot of these things have to be done internally, but there's some externals that I think are part of the long-term peaceful solution for Afghanistan.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming, for your insights on having been there on Election Day in Afghanistan, as well as legal insights on the process itself. I think it's been very useful to our viewers to have your input. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Pleasure.
We'd love to hear what you think about this or any other poll program. Just go online to aamtv.tv or visit us at tolo.tv. See you next week for another edition of Poll.